September 3rd, 1260. The Jezreel Valley. Dawn broke over the spring called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, where legend claimed a shepherd boy once felled a giant with a single stone. Now, beneath that same Palestinian sun, another army of giants prepared to crush another desperate people. The valley lay quiet in those final moments before battle, deceptively peaceful, the grass still wet with dew, the spring water running clear and cold over ancient stones. But the silence was a lie. The Mongol Horde had swept from the edge of the world, an empire built on bones and ashes and the screams of the conquered. They had shattered kingdoms that had stood for centuries. They had burned Baghdad to its foundations, thrown the last caliph's body into the Tigris, and left the capital of Islam as a monument to ruin. They had taken Damascus without mercy and Aleppo without pause. They had ground Persia into dust. Syria lay beneath their hooves like a beaten dog. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had guided the Islamic world for 500 years, had been extinguished in a week of fire and steel. Egypt stood alone, the last major Muslim power, the final fortress, the end of the line. But in the pre-dawn darkness, 20,000 Mamluk warriors knelt in prayer facing Mecca, their foreheads pressed to the earth. They were slave soldiers, men who had been bought and sold like cattle, trained since childhood to fight and die. Their sultan, Qutuz, walked among them and threw down his helmet so his face was visible to all. His voice carried across the ranks. "If I am killed today, let it be for Islam. If we break and run, Egypt falls. Here we stand." The Mongols believed themselves invincible. They had never known permanent defeat. They had conquered more of the world than any empire in human memory, from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, from the frozen steppes of Russia to the deserts of Persia. By sunset, one of those truths would be broken forever. This is the story of Ain Jalut, the battle that held the gate. For 40 years, the Mongols had been the nightmare that rode from the east. Under Genghis Khan and his descendants, they had built an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna. They had obliterated the armies of China, Persia, and Russia. They had toppled dynasties that seemed eternal. Their horse archers moved like the wind, their discipline was absolute, and their cruelty was legendary. They did not negotiate, they did not retreat. They conquered or they destroyed. And there was no third option. In 1258, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, had brought that terror to the Islamic world's beating heart. Baghdad, the city of peace, jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, fell after a siege that ended in slaughter. The Mongols drove the Caliph al-Mustasim through his own streets, wrapped in a carpet, then trampled him to death beneath their horses. The great libraries burned. The Tigris, men said, ran black with ink from the destroyed books, then red with the blood of scholars. Hundreds of thousands died. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had guided Islam for 5 centuries, was extinguished in a week of fire and steel. The Christian powers of Europe watched with grim satisfaction. Pope Alexander IV sent letters to Hulagu expressing pleasure that he might convert to Christianity. The Crusader states saw the Mongols as potential allies against their Muslim neighbors. Armenian King Hayton and Prince Bohemond VI of Antioch offered their armies to Hulagu, marching beside the Mongols as they carved through Syria. In 1259 and 1260, the Mongol juggernaut rolled south. Aleppo fell. Damascus, the ancient city of the Umayyads, surrendered without a fight. The Mongol general Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian of the Naiman tribe, entered the city in triumph. Christian populations in conquered cities were often spared, while Muslims were massacred. The pattern was clear. The Mongol-Christian alliance was grinding Islam into dust. Only Egypt remained. The Mamluk Sultanate, barely a decade old, ruled from Cairo. The Mamluks themselves were an unlikely power, a warrior caste of slave soldiers, mostly Turkic and Circassian, who had seized control of Egypt in 1250. They were professional soldiers from childhood, trained in martial academies, experts in mounted combat and the sword. They had toppled their own masters and crowned themselves kings. Their sultan, Qutuz, was a survivor of the Mongol destruction of Khwarezm, sold into slavery as a boy, risen through skill and ruthlessness to the throne of Egypt. He knew what the Mongols were. He had seen their work firsthand. In 1260, Hulagu sent envoys to Cairo with a message that was not a negotiation, but an execution notice. Submit or be destroyed. We have conquered all who stood against us. Your fortresses will not save you. Your soldiers will not save you. Your God will not save you. Qutuz responded by executing the envoys and displaying their heads on the gates of Cairo. War was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. But fate intervened before the armies could meet. Word reached the Mongol camp that Mongke Khan, the great Khan in distant Karakoram, had died in China. The succession was in doubt. Hulagu, as a potential heir, had to return east with the bulk of his army, leaving only a fraction of his forces, perhaps 20,000 men, to hold his western conquests. He placed them under Kitbuka, his most trusted general, and rode east with the rest. Qutuz saw his moment. The Mamluks mobilized from Cairo in late July 1260. They marched north through territory that should have been hostile. The Crusader-held coastal cities of Palestine. But the Crusader barons of Acre, despite their recent cooperation with the Mongols, recognized a greater threat when they saw one. The Mongols were unpredictable conquerors. The Mamluks were known quantities, trading partners, sometimes enemies, sometimes neutral neighbors. Better the devil they knew. In a decision that would shape the region's fate, the Crusaders granted the Mamluk army safe passage through their lands. They sold them provisions. They allowed them to camp near Acre itself to resupply and rest. It was not friendship. It was cold calculation. If the Mamluks fell, the Mongols would own everything from Persia to the Mediterranean, and the Crusader kingdoms would be surrounded. Qutuz led his army northeast from Acre, moving through Galilee toward the interior. Scouts reported Kitbuka's position. The Mongol general had moved south from his base at Baalbek with his army, passing east of Lake Tiberias, probing toward Egypt. The two forces were converging on the Jezreel Valley, that ancient killing ground where Egyptians and Assyrians and Persians had bled each other for 3,000 years. Qutuz chose his ground carefully. The spring at Ain Jalut, fed by underground waters, provided a reliable source for his army. More importantly, the terrain was broken, with hills and ridges surrounding the relatively flat valley floor. It was not ideal ground for the sweeping Mongol cavalry charges that had shattered so many armies. It could be turned into a trap. His second-in-command, Baybars, knew these hills. Years earlier, fleeing from enemies, he had hidden in this very region. He understood every ridge, every wadi, every approach. Together, Qutuz and Baybars devised their strategy. They would use the Mongols' own tactics against them. The Mongols were masters of the feigned retreat, a tactic where a small force would engage the enemy, then appear to break and run, drawing the enemy into pursuit, straight into an ambush by the main army. It had worked from Hungary to Persia. Now the Mamluks would try it themselves. Baybars positioned the bulk of the Mamluk army in the hills around Ain Jalut, concealed among the trees and broken ground. Only a small force would remain visible on the valley floor, seemingly exposed, seemingly vulnerable. They would provoke the Mongols, then fall back, drawing them deeper into the valley, where the hidden wings could crash down on their flanks. It was a desperate gamble. If the Mongols suspected the trap, if they refused to commit their full strength, if they maneuvered around the valley instead of through it, the plan would collapse. But Kutuz had read his enemy well. The Mongols had never lost. They had no reason to suspect that a Muslim army would dare to use their own strategy against them. On the night of September 2nd, the Mamluk soldiers prayed. They sharpened their swords and checked their horses. In the hills, 20,000 men waited in silence, forbidden from lighting fires that might give away their positions. On the valley floor, Baybar's vanguard settled in, knowing they would face the first Mongol charge alone, knowing many of them would not see another dawn. The Mongol army approached from the northeast, confident, unstoppable. The rightful rulers of the earth, Kitbuka, the Christian general who had helped destroy the Muslim caliphate, rode at their head with his Mongol cavalry, supported by Armenian and Georgian Christian troops who had sworn fealty to Hulagu. They had Syrian auxiliaries as well, though Kitbuka kept them in reserve, suspecting they might defect to the Mamluks when battle was joined. Neither side knew it yet, but the balance of world history rode toward that spring in the Jezreel Valley. September 3rd, 1260. First light. The Mongol scouts reported enemy positions near the spring. A Mamluk force, substantial but not overwhelming, arrayed on the valley floor near Ain Jalut. Kitbuka studied the ground. The hills around the valley were thick with vegetation, broken terrain, not ideal for his cavalry, but not impassable either. The Mamluks appeared to be offering battle in the open, the kind of fight the Mongols had won 100 times before. The Mamluk force on the valley floor was led by Baybars himself. He rode back and forth before his men, visible, seemingly agitated. It looked like a commander uncertain of his ground, trying to rally troops who knew they faced annihilation. To Mongol eyes, it looked like fear. Kitbuka ordered the advance. The Mongol cavalry moved forward in their characteristic formations, horse archers in the vanguard, heavier cavalry behind, the entire force capable of fluid, coordinated movement that had bewildered enemies from China to Poland. Their bows were composite recurve masterpieces, capable of penetrating armor at ranges that European crossbows could only dream of. Their horses were small, tough steppe ponies, bred for endurance and speed. Their riders had been training for this since childhood. The Mongols had one vulnerability. They were outnumbered. 20,000 against 20,000 sounds equal, but the Mamluks had the advantage of position and preparation. And Kitbuka did not know that most of the Mamluk army was not on the valley floor. They were waiting in the hills. The Mongol vanguard reached bowshot range. Arrows hissed through the morning air, a sound like tearing silk magnified 1,000 times. Mamluk riders began to fall. Horses screamed. The Mongol archers, masters of mounted archery, could shoot forward, backward, to either side, while at full gallop. They could empty a quiver in minutes and make every shot count. Baybars held his formation for perhaps an hour, absorbing the arrow storm, returning fire, but clearly getting the worst of the exchange. The sun climbed higher. Men died. The valley floor began to fill with smoke and dust. And then, as if reaching a breaking point, Baybar's force began to pull back. It was not a rout. Not quite, but it looked like the beginning of one. The Mamluk cavalry turned and began to retreat south and west toward the hills. They did not break entirely, but they were clearly giving ground, moving away from the spring, abandoning the position they had held. To Kitbuka, it must have looked familiar. This was how Muslim armies broke when faced with Mongol power. They realized they could not win. Their morale crumbled, and they fled. Now was the time to pursue, to turn retreat into massacre, to drive them into the hills and slaughter them as they ran. The Mongol general committed his full strength to the chase. The entire Mongol army surged forward across the valley floor, pursuing Baybar's fleeing force. The Armenian and Georgian Christian cavalry charged with them, loyal vassals of the Mongol Empire, certain of another victory in a long string of victories. The thunder of 20,000 horses shook the earth. Dust rose in great clouds. The Mamluks before them seemed to be disintegrating, riders scattering toward the hills on either side of the valley. Kitbuka had taken the bait. The moment came with the sound of drums and the ululation of war cries. From the hills on both flanks of the valley, from positions the Mongols had not suspected were occupied, the main body of the Mamluk army erupted into the open. Thousands of cavalry burst from concealment and drove down the slopes toward the exposed Mongol flanks. The trap had been sprung. The Mongols, strung out in pursuit across the valley floor, suddenly found themselves attacked from both sides at once. The disciplined formations that made them so deadly began to fracture. Units turned to face the new threats, but there was no time to reform properly, no time to establish proper firing lines, no time to execute the coordinated maneuvers that were the Mongol trademark. Sultan Kutuz, who had been with the hidden forces in the hills, threw down his helmet so his face was visible to all his men and shouted, "Wa Islama, O Islam! For Islam, for survival, for revenge against the conquerors who had destroyed his childhood home and sold him into slavery." The Mamluk cavalry crashed into the Mongol flanks like an iron fist. These were not soft city dwellers or peasant conscripts. These were slave soldiers trained from boyhood, professional warriors who knew nothing but the martial arts. They were experts with sword, lance, mace, and bow. They rode horses bred for war, and they were fighting for their faith, their kingdom, and their lives. The valley became chaos. The Mongols tried to regroup, to form defensive positions, but the momentum had shifted. Baybar's retreating force turned and charged back into the fight, slamming into the Mongol front even as the flanking forces crushed in from the sides. The Mongol army was being enveloped. Kitbuka, the Christian general, found himself fighting for control of a battle that was slipping away. He was a veteran of countless campaigns, a warrior who had helped destroy Baghdad and Damascus. He rallied his men, trying to create space, trying to break free of the trap. The Mongol heavy cavalry, the elite guard, formed around him and drove forward, attempting to punch through the Mamluk lines. For hours, the battle raged. The sun climbed to its zenith. The heat of the Palestinian summer pressed down. Men fought in a fog of dust and smoke, identifying friend from foe by banners and armor, and sometimes not at all. Swords broke, lances shattered, horses fell and threw their riders. The wounded crawled or lay still. The valley floor became a killing ground. The Syrian auxiliaries that Kitbuka had kept in reserve, sensing which way the wind was blowing, began to desert to the Mamluk side. They were Muslims fighting for the Mongols out of fear or necessity, and they had no love for the conquerors who had ravaged their homeland. As the battle turned against the Mongols, they saw their chance and took it, riding over to Kutuz's banners. The Mongol lines buckled. Small groups found themselves surrounded, cut off from support. The horse archers, deadly at range, were less effective in the close quarters melee that the valley had become. The Mamluks pressed harder, sensing victory, driving forward with sword and mace, targeting Mongol officers, trying to decapitate the enemy command structure. Kitbuka fought with the courage that had made him one of Hulagu's most trusted generals. Accounts differ on exactly how he fell. Some say he was killed in the fighting, cut down by multiple Mamluk warriors as he tried to rally his men for one last charge. Others say he was captured, wounded and surrounded, pulled from his horse and brought before Qutuz. If the latter account is true, the final moments were defiant. Kitbuka, the Christian who had helped destroy the Muslim Caliphate, faced the Muslim Sultan without fear. He reportedly told Qutuz that Hulagu would return, that the full might of the Mongol Empire would descend upon Egypt, that this victory meant nothing against the storm that would come. Qutuz, if the story is true, replied simply, "Then let him come. We will meet him as we met you." Kitbuka was executed on the battlefield, beheaded as was the custom for captured enemy commanders. With their general dead, the Mongol army broke. The retreat became a rout. Units scattered, trying to escape the valley, riding north toward Baisan. The Mamluks pursued them, giving no quarter, cutting down fleeing soldiers, turning victory into annihilation. At Baisan, 8 miles away, remnants of the Mongol army tried to make a stand. They were overwhelmed and destroyed. By sunset on September the 3rd, 1260, the battlefield at Ain Jalut was silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the cries of looters picking through the dead. Mongol bodies lay scattered across the valley floor. Their banners were trampled. Their reputation of invincibility was shattered. For the first time since the Mongols had begun their westward conquest, 40 years earlier, they had been decisively defeated in open battle and could not return to avenge the loss. In the immediate wake of the battle, the Mamluk army did not rest. Qutuz knew that Hulagu might return with overwhelming force, and he moved quickly to secure his gains. The Mamluks swept north, retaking Aleppo and Damascus, cities that had fallen to the Mongols mere months before. The Muslim populations, who had been slaughtered or terrorized under Mongol Christian occupation, welcomed the Mamluks as liberators. The Christian populations, who had collaborated with the Mongols, now faced retribution. The Mongols attempted one counterattack in December 1260, sending a force back into Syria. They sacked Aleppo in revenge for Kitbuka's death, but could make no further progress. After 2 weeks, they withdrew back across the Euphrates. They would never again threaten Egypt. Internecine war among the Mongols themselves ensured they could not return in force. Berka Khan, the Muslim ruler of the Golden Horde in the north, was horrified by Hulagu's destruction of Baghdad and the murder of the Caliph. The two Mongol Khans went to war with each other, and Hulagu, facing enemies on multiple fronts, could never again gather the strength to push west. The Mamluk Sultan Qutuz did not live to enjoy his triumph for long. On the road back to Cairo, he was assassinated by his own commanders in a conspiracy led by Baybars. Whether the plot was driven by ambition, old grudges, or political necessity, the result was the same. Baybars became Sultan of Egypt and would go on to spend the next 17 years consolidating Mamluk power and systematically destroying the Crusader kingdoms. The Battle of Ain Jalut had determined 3 fates. First, the Mongol westward expansion was permanently halted. The Islamic world would survive. Second, the Mamluk Sultanate was established as the dominant power in the Middle East, a position it would hold for 2.5 centuries. Third, the Crusader states, caught between 2 powerful forces, had lost their room to maneuver. Without the Mongol-Christian alliance to balance the Mamluks, they were doomed. Within 30 years, the last Crusader fortress in the Holy Land would fall. On the evening of September the 3rd, 1260, as the last light faded over the Jezreel Valley, soldiers searched the battlefield for their wounded. The spring at Ain Jalut, where legend said a shepherd boy had once killed a giant, ran red. Bodies of Mongols and Mamluks and Armenians and Georgians lay together in death, the politics and faiths that had driven them to this place, now meaningless. Sultan Baybars, who had sprung the trap and led the feigned retreat that drew the Mongols to their doom, rode through the carnage and looked upon what had been wrought. An empire's advance had been stopped. A civilization had been saved. But the cost was measured in thousands of lives scattered across the valley floor. In the silence of the battlefield, with smoke still rising, and the dying still crying out for water, or mercy, or God, one truth was undeniable: the world had changed. The Mongols were not invincible. The gate had held. And in the towns and cities from Cairo to Damascus, from Aleppo to Jerusalem, Muslims would remember the name Ain Jalut and know that on one desperate September day, their civilization had been saved by 20,000 warriors who refused to run when the whole world expected them to break. The sun set over the spring of Goliath, and the Mongol storm, which had broken armies and kingdoms from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, finally broke itself.